For years, there's been this strange silence hanging over Dorian Yates whenever Mike Mentzer's name comes up. Fans noticed it. They'd see Dorian talk about contest prep, injuries, even the dark side of bodybuilding. But when the conversation shifted to Mentzer, the answers got short, careful, almost cold. On one side, you had Dorian, the brutal, stone-faced shadow who let his physique do the talking. On the other, Mike Mentzer, the loud, chain-smoking philosopher who tried to blow up the entire bodybuilding rulebook with his heavy-duty system and logical rants against bro science. Now at 63, Dorian is finally done being quiet. He's opening up about what Mike really meant to him, not just as a training influence, but as a man he respected, questioned, and never fully escaped. He talks about the hidden mentorship, the tension, the regrets he carries, and the warnings he believes today's lifters are stubbornly ignoring. And this isn't some tabloid, gossip-filled drama. This is the story of how one intense, troubled mind helped shape the most feared champion of the 90s, and why, all these years later, Dorian Yates thinks you still haven't heard the full truth about Mike Mentzer. Before he became the most feared man on a bodybuilding stage, Dorian Yates was just a quiet kid from England with a chip on his shoulder and a stack of worn-out magazines. He wasn't the polished champion you see in highlight reels. He was that guy training in cold, cramped gyms, living in a country where bodybuilding wasn't glamorous. It was weird. While California had sunshine, palm trees, and Gold's Gym, Dorian had gray skies, concrete, and whatever equipment he could get his hands on. In the early 90s, the world would come to know him as a six-time Mr. Olympia, from 1992 to 1997. The shadow, the ghost who vanished between shows and then reappeared every year looking freakishly denser, harder, and somehow even more unbreakable. He almost never did the media tours. He didn't play the celebrity game. And he didn't hang around expos shaking hands. He would just disappear into his bunker, brutalize himself in the gym, and then show up 12 months later looking like he'd been built in a lab. But long before the lights, before the Sandows, before the myth, he was sitting in a small room, flipping through Weeder magazines, hunting for answers. No coach, no YouTube, no science-based breakdown videos, just ink on paper and a young guy trying to figure out how to turn raw frustration into muscle. Most of what he read was the same recycled advice. More sets, more volume, more time in the gym. Train twice a day, hammer every angle, live under the bar. Buried between glossy photos of Venice Beach icons, he found something different. Mike Mentzer's heavy-duty columns. They didn't read like motivational posters. They read like arguments. While everyone else bragged about marathon workouts and endless sets, Mentzer was doing the opposite. He was breaking things down like a lawyer. Cause and effect, stimulus and response, stress and recovery. He wasn't just saying what to do. He was explaining why. Why shorter workouts might build more muscle. Why fewer sets could actually be more productive. Why mindless volume was just glorified punishment. For a teenage Dorian, naturally skeptical, naturally intense, this wasn't just interesting. It was a revelation. Here was someone telling him that being different wasn't a disadvantage. It was a weapon. He didn't have the perfect environment. He didn't have top-tier coaches. But he could have the one thing most people refuse to use: logic. If everyone else was blindly copying the biggest guy in the gym, Dorian could leapfrog them by understanding what actually made the body grow. And Mentzer wasn't some random writer either. He was Mr. Universe, a top Olympia contender, a guy who had already stood under the same lights Dorian dreamed of stepping into. And to a lot of hardcore fans, he was the rightful winner of the infamous 1980 Mr. Olympia, the night Arnold walked away with a controversial victory that people still argue about decades later. So when Mentzer questioned the system, it wasn't coming from a bitter nobody. It was coming from a man who had played the game at the highest level and decided the rules were broken. Here was a man who had stood toe-to-toe with the biggest names in the sport, then turned around and attacked the very training culture that built them. He told people they were overtraining. He told them their obsession with volume was wrecking their progress. He told them intensity mattered more than time served. To most lifters, that sounded insane. To Dorian, it sounded like the only thing that made sense. Years later, Dorian would openly call Mike the most influential figure when it came to his training. Not because he copied every word like a disciple, but because Mentzer went against the grain. He forced people to question the religion of high volume, forced them to stop treating soreness and exhaustion as proof of progress. Instead of blindly suffering through 2-hour chest days just to say you worked hard, Mentzer pushed the idea of targeted suffering, one brutal, focused effort done with absolute intent. That attitude, challenge the norm, demand a reason, train with ruthless efficiency, sank deep into Dorian's mind long before he ever walked on stage as the Shadow. It shaped how he thought, how he trained, and how he saw the whole industry. While other guys were memorizing routines, Dorian was dissecting principles. But it wasn't until they met in person that Dorian realized just how far Mike was willing to push a human body. If you believe the legends, there was a day at Gold's Gym in the early 90s when the whole room just stopped. No clanging plates, no ego-lifting contests, no one pretending not to stare while focusing on their set. In a place where everyone thought they were the main character, suddenly all eyes were dragged to one corner of the room. Because there, under the harsh fluorescent lights, Mike Mentzer was about to run a rising British pro named Dorian Yates through a full-blown heavy-duty session, and nobody wanted to miss what happened next. Dorian was already earning a reputation as a problem. Thick, grainy, and freakishly dense, he wasn't built like the pretty Californian posters on the wall. He looked like a piece of industrial machinery. But on that day, standing next to Mentzer, he was the student. Mentzer had the clipboard, the plan, and the reputation of a man who didn't just train hard. He rewrote what hard even meant. The unspoken question hanging in the air was simple. Could this quiet, pale guy from England survive the philosophy he'd been reading about for years? Heavy duty in theory already sounded extreme. On paper, it almost looked lazy to people who equated suffering with hours spent in the gym. But in practice, it was something else entirely. No endless warm-up pyramids, no ego sets just to pile on plates for the look of it. No marathon chest and tricep circus. Mentzer's approach was simple and ruthless. Brief, infrequent, insanely intense sessions. You come in prepared, you warm up just enough to switch the machine on, and then you hit one all-out working set. Not 3, not 5, 1. That single set isn't just to failure the way most people claim it. It's failure, then a rest pause where you squeeze out another rep or two your brain swears aren't there. It's slow, grinding negatives that make every second feel like a minute. It's static holds where you freeze in the most painful part of the rep. Muscles shaking, lungs on fire. Mentzer's voice pushing you to stay right there and live in that discomfort. And when it's over, that's it. No do-over. No one more for the gram. You either gave everything in that moment or you didn't. For a guy like Dorian, who already lived in a blood and guts mindset, this was like pouring rocket fuel on an already raging fire. He wasn't scared of pain, he almost seemed to go looking for it. When he talks about that final working set, you can almost feel the room closing in, the bar moving slower rep by rep, sweat stinging his eyes, his breath getting shorter while Mentzer leans in, demanding one more inch, one more second, one more rep past what felt remotely possible. On the outside, it was just another set. On the inside, it was a controlled car crash. In that moment, heavy duty stopped being an article in a magazine and turned into something alive. It was Mentzer's ideas, perfectly distilled. Cut the fluff, amplify the pain, sharpen the focus. But once Dorian locked in, the whole thing shifted. Heavy duty on Mike's clipboard became blood and guts in Dorian's hands. Pure balls-to-the-wall ferocious intensity with zero room for excuses. Mentzer supplied the blueprint. Dorian became the proof that it worked. Somewhere between those gasping breaths and shaking legs, when the last rep was over and the gym slowly started breathing again, Mike dropped the line that would reshape Dorian's entire career. Cut back. One hard-working set per exercise. No endless back-off sets just in case. No extra fluff to make you feel productive. Just precise warm-ups and then a single lethal set where you empty the tank. Dorian didn't walk out of Golds and turn into a copy-paste Mentzer clone. He took the core principle and ran it through his own filter. He kept the brutality, added his own structure, adjusted his split, and built a system around one idea. Train less often, but when you do train, you go to a place most people will never visit. He carried that philosophy back to his dungeon-like gym in England. No ocean breeze, no Hollywood crowd, just concrete, iron, and an almost unhealthy level of focus. 2 years later, he walked on stage at the 1992 Mr. Olympia, looking like something that had been carved out of stone with a chainsaw, and took home his first Sandow. To the crowd, it looked like a sudden takeover. To the people who knew, that moment was born in that one corner of Gold's gym, under Mentzer's watch, in a single set where Dorian proved he was willing to go further than anyone else in the room. Soon they weren't just training partners, they were business partners. And that's when the story gets complicated. When the training chemistry clicked, it didn't stay just under the bar. Before long, Dorian, Mike, and Mike's brother Ray turned that shared hardcore identity into a business. They launched MYM, Mentzer Yates Mentzer, also known as Heavy Duty Inc., a clothing brand built around their image as no-nonsense, high-intensity warriors. It wasn't about flashy fitness fashion, it was about sending a signal. If you wore heavy duty, you were telling the world you weren't there to pump up. You were there to suffer on purpose. During that period, this wasn't some casual one-off collaboration. For a couple of years, Dorian and Mike trained together multiple times. Yates has mentioned they hit sessions maybe 5 or 6 times over a 2-year window. Just enough to leave a deep imprint, not enough to become a permanent daily routine. Between those workouts and the business, it started to look less like Mentzer the writer and Yates the fan, and more like a small brotherhood built around intensity, rebellion, and a shared hatred of wasted time. But even inside that alliance, the personalities couldn't have been more different. Mike was the philosopher, talking, debating, attacking normal training in public, writing, lecturing, questioning everyone and everything. Dorian was the opposite, tunnel-visioned, quiet, almost antisocial when it came to bodybuilding politics. He wasn't trying to convert the world, he was trying to beat it. Mike wanted to change how everyone trained. Dorian just wanted to train in the way that made him unbeatable. That difference would come back to bite them in the eyes of fans. Over time, people noticed that Dorian never became a full-on heavy-duty cult guy. He credited Mike openly. He called him a massive influence, but he also said very plainly that heavy duty wasn't magic. It was a good system with solid logic, not some mystical secret that fixed everything. For a certain type of diehard Mentzer follower, that sounded like disrespect. Early online forums and gym gossip warped that nuance into something uglier. The story mutated into Dorian hated Mentzer, or Yates used Mike's name, got rich and famous, then dumped his system. It didn't matter that Dorian was still training with the same core principles. The narrative was juicier if there was beef. But while fans argued about training systems, Mike's own life was heading into a much darker place than most people realized. At his peak, Mike Mentzer looked untouchable. He was Mr. Universe, a thick, polished powerhouse with the kind of structure that made judges take notice the second he walked on stage. His Olympia placings put him right up against the very best in the world, and for a while it felt like he was destined to hold a Sandow. Then came 1980, the infamous Mr. Olympia in Sydney. Arnold walked away with the title in a result so controversial that fans still argue about it. For many, that night didn't just rob Mentzer of a trophy, it shattered his faith in the entire sport. On the surface, Mike kept moving forward, writing, coaching, preaching heavy duty with even more conviction. But behind the scenes, the picture was a lot darker. He struggled with chronic insomnia and heavy mood swings. To keep his mind sharp and his intensity switched on, he leaned hard on meds and stimulants. What looked like relentless focus from the outside was in reality a dangerous cycle that kept his nervous system redlining. It worked for a while until it didn't. Over the years, stories started to leak out of gyms and back rooms. Mentzer showing up wired and agitated. Long, heated rants that crossed the line from passionate to unstable. People whispering that the genius who once rewrote training logic was slipping into something much more fragile. He went from that revolutionary coach you have to learn from to that guy everyone has a story about. And not all of those stories were flattering. You have to remember the environment he was in too. This was a world where extreme physiques, constant pain, and heavy chemical use were normalized. Destroying yourself for a look wasn't the exception, it was part of the job description. Mike just pushed further than almost anyone, both in his body and in his mind. Where other guys abused their joints, he burned through his nervous system. Where others flirted with the edge, he lived on it. Dorian saw part of this unfold from the outside. He saw the visionary who had changed his entire philosophy on training. And at the same time, he saw a man whose life looked like it was slowly burning itself out. The mentor who taught him logic and restraint was caught in a storm of his own making, and there was only so much anyone could do to pull him back. And then in 2001, everything ended, twice. In June 2001, the news hit like a punch to the chest. Mike Mentzer had been found dead in his apartment, taken by heart complications at just 49 years old. For a lot of people, it didn't compute. This was the man who built his entire identity on logic, structure, and control. The guy who believed you could almost outthink the chaos of training by planning it down to the last rep. He preached efficiency, recovery, and avoiding pointless burnout. In a sport full of chaos and impulse, he sounded like the one adult in the room. And now, in a single headline, he was gone. For the hardcore fans who followed every word he wrote, it felt like someone had ripped a chapter out of the bodybuilding story mid-sentence. Mentzer wasn't just another ex-pro. He was the rebel who promised there was a better way, a smarter way, a way where you didn't have to wreck your body to grow. Seeing that man taken so suddenly and so young shook people in a way normal retirements and quiet exits never could. Before the shock could even settle, it got worse. Just 2 days later, his brother Ray, the other half of that intense, gritty Mentzer presence, also passed away, this time from serious kidney issues. Ray wasn't just Mike's brother. He'd trained with him, stood on stage with him, and helped build that heavy-duty aura in and out of the gym. Losing Mike was like losing the voice. Losing Ray right after was like losing the echo. 2 brothers, 2 deaths, almost back to back. It felt less like bad luck and more like the curtain dropping on a whole era. The bodybuilding world wasn't just mourning freaky physiques or dramatic contest placings, it was mourning a mind, a philosophy, and a pair of personalities that had reshaped how people even thought about training. There was this sense that something important had ended before it had really been appreciated. In the middle of all that, attention naturally shifted to the one man everyone knew had been deeply shaped by Mentzer's ideas, Dorian Yates. If anyone was going to deliver the emotional definitive tribute, people assumed it would be him. But Dorian didn't do what the media script would have liked. There was no big tribute tour, no sit-down special with sad piano music and slow-motion clips, no dramatic, tear-filled documentary where he walked through old gyms and relived every conversation. His public reaction was brief, measured, almost clinical. He acknowledged Mike's importance, said what needed to be said, and then went quiet. From the outside, that silence felt off. Fans watching from afar started filling in the blanks themselves. The rumors wrote themselves. Did they fall out? Did Dorian distance himself to protect his own brand? Did he just move on and leave Mentzer as a footnote once he'd made it? In the age before social media confessionals, people weren't used to someone not turning grief into content. But if you stop listening to the gossip and actually look at what Dorian did, a different picture shows up. He never abandoned the core of what Mike taught him. He kept training people with the same high-intensity logic. Low volume, one truly all-out working set. Ruthless focus on effort instead of circus-level volume. He kept talking about the value of brief, brutal sessions instead of ego-driven 2-hour marathons just to feel hardcore. The fingerprints of Mentzer's influence were still all over his methods. You could hear it in how he described failure, how he talked about recovery, how he dismissed pointless fluff. What you rarely saw was raw emotion. But that wasn't new. That was Dorian. This was the same man who barely celebrated after winning Olympias, who treated world titles like items on a checklist. He wasn't built to cry on cue for a camera. He grieved the same way he trained, privately, intensely, and without theatrics. So on the surface, you had a dead mentor, a quiet student, and a lot of whispers. Underneath, you had something more complicated, a man still living out the principles he learned, even if he wasn't ready to unpack the pain behind them. It would take decades, and a very different Dorian Yates at 60 plus, softer in tone, more reflective, less interested in being the shadow, before he finally opened up about what Mike really meant to him. By the time Dorian hits his early 60s, he isn't the stone-faced shadow anymore. The beard is gray, the stage lights are long gone, and the man who once spoke in short, blunt sentences is suddenly reflective. On podcasts, in interviews, and especially in long, thoughtful social media posts, he finally starts saying Mike Mentzer's name the way fans always guessed he felt it, with open respect. He calls Mike the most influential figure on his training, not Whiter, not some random guru, but the man who showed him it was okay to question everything. He gives Mike credit not just for heavy duty as a concept, but for the mindset behind it. Dorian talks about how Mentzer didn't just hand him a program. He handed him permission to ask why about every set, every rep, every tradition the bodybuilding world treated like holy scripture. Why so many sets? Why so much volume? Why chase exhaustion instead of progress? For a guy who already had a logical brain, that way of thinking was dynamite. Dorian also makes it very clear it was Mike who convinced him to strip his workouts down to a single brutal working set. That one idea, warm up, then give absolutely everything in one committed effort, became the spine of Dorian's entire training system. He said flat out that this was a key factor in his transformation from top-level pro into almost unbeatable Mr. Olympia. Once he locked into that one-set mentality, every workout became a life-or-death moment instead of a checklist. As the internet era twists Mentzer's name into clickbait and watered-down hit routines, Dorian finds himself defending his old mentor. When people misrepresent heavy duty or slap Mentzer's face on gimmicky programs, he pushes back. He reminds everyone that the point was never shortcuts or magic tricks. It was substance. Real effort, structured intensity. Muscles don't care about hype, he says. They respond to stress, recovery, and consistency, not whatever looks cool on social media this week. And he finally takes a hammer to one of the longest-running myths, the idea that there was bad blood between him and Mike. Dorian explains that he never hated Mentzer, never resented him. The distance people thought they saw wasn't about rejection, it was about perspective. He refused to turn any system into a religion, even Mike's. He used what worked, adjusted what didn't, and stayed loyal to principles, not dogma. But the real twist isn't just what he says about Mike, it's what he admits about himself. By the time Dorian starts really opening up about Mike, he's also finally honest about himself. The once invincible shadow now talks openly about the bill that came due. He admits he trained too hard, too often, for too long, even by his own extreme standards. Torn biceps, wrecked triceps, nerve issues, chronic pain. His body ended up as a map of every time he refused to back off. What looked like unbreakable discipline in the 90s now reads, in his own words, like walking a tightrope with no safety net. He says if he could go back, he wouldn't change the work ethic, but he'd change the way he used it. He's admitted he'd be a bit more easier on himself and on the people around him. He'd still train brutally hard, but he'd enjoy the process a little more instead of living in a constant pressure chamber. He talks about how he spent years so deep in the tunnel, obsessed with progression, condition, domination, that normal life barely existed. Relationships, simple joys, even his own mental peace took a back seat to the next workout and the next show. Out of that reflection comes a very clear warning. Intensity is powerful. It can turn ordinary genetics into something legendary, but without balance, it becomes a weapon pointed straight at you. Dorian's story ends up echoing the darker parts of Mentzer's, two men who preached logic and efficiency, but still pushed their bodies and minds right up to and sometimes over the edge. Heavy duty and blood and guts both promised less volume, but the mindset behind them was still all or nothing. When that mindset goes unmanaged, it doesn't just build champions, it also breaks them. These days, Dorian sounds different. He still believes in hard training. He still preaches that one all-out focus set, done with perfect form and true effort, is enough to spark growth. But now that message is wrapped in talk about health, longevity, nervous system stress, breathing, recovery, and life outside the gym. He warns lifters not to confuse punishment with progress, not to sacrifice decades of life just to look insane for a few summers. The core heavy-duty idea survives, intensity over volume, but now it comes with fine print. Respect recovery, respect technique, respect the fact that you only get one body. So what do we do with two men who changed the game and paid so much for it? In the end, it's hard to separate where Mike Mentzer ends and Dorian Yates begins. Mentzer supplied the blueprint. Less volume, more logic, brutally honest effort instead of showy, half-hearted grind. Yates took that blueprint, dragged it into a dark English dungeon of a gym, and turned it into something terrifyingly real. Together, even if they didn't plan it that way, they created the modern template for high-intensity bodybuilding. Short sessions, laser focus, no wasted motion, no wasted sets. But there's a brutal irony buried inside that legacy. This whole system was built on less volume, more logic. It was supposed to protect lifters from the burnout and overtraining that came with endless sets and marathon workouts. Yet when you look at how it played out at the absolute extreme, you see the collateral damage: torn muscles, wrecked joints, heart stress, insomnia, mental strain, nervous systems pushed past redline. When you mix train smarter with two men who only know how to live at 110%, the result isn't balance, it's a different kind of overload. Even now, debates rage online about who Mike Mentzer really was. Was he a misunderstood genius decades ahead of his time? Or was he a tragic cautionary tale, a man whose brain and body couldn't survive the intensity he demanded from both? And right in the middle of that argument sits Dorian. He's the living proof that Mentzer's ideas work, the grateful student who used them to carve out one of the most dominant physiques in history. But he's also the cautious critic who openly admits there was a cost, and the loyal defender who still steps in when people twist Mentzer's name for clicks and gimmicks. So you're left with a set of uncomfortable questions. Did bodybuilding actually learn from these two? Or did it just copy the intensity and ignore the warnings? Are we any smarter now, or just better at filming our self-destruction in HD? You tell me. Was Mike Mentzer a savior of smart training, or a tragic warning about what happens when obsession grabs the steering wheel? And did Dorian Yates truly honor his mentor's legacy, or did he wait too long to really speak on it? Let me know what you think down in the comments.